On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for our 2024 celebration of Women's History Month. In this program, prize-winning biographer Dr. Emily Toth tells the true life story of Kate Chopin, a Louisiana writer whose novel The Awakening celebrates its 125th anniversary this year. Called Poison by the St. Louis Republic and Trite and Sordid by the Pittsburgh Leader, The Awakening shocked readers in its day, and yet it thrills modern audiences. Emily Toth, a lifelong fan of gossip and biography, has authored 5 books on Kate Chopin and written about Grace Metalius, the author of Peyton Place. Toth learned about oral history when studying for her Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins University and has honed her listening and secret-finding skills as a professor at Louisiana State University. And now, Kate Chopin's Secret Life and Public Notoriety, presented by Dr. Emily Toth.
Okay. Kate Chopin lived among a lot of eccentric people, and I'll tell you about her life in a moment. But first, I want to mention her son, because he was asked about her son Felix. She had many sons, and he was asked about her, and he said that she hung around with a group of pink-red people who were suffragettes who expressed their independence by wearing peculiar clothing. So that made me wonder about Kate Chopin. What kind of peculiar clothing did she wear? And I've gathered together, I'll show you some of the pictures that I've gathered of hers. There isn't anything that shows her wearing peculiar clothing. So I think her son was being eccentric, just the way she was. She had 6 children. Every one of them had some kind of eccentricity, and that was one of his. We'll come back to him. This is her son, Felix. But first, I want to talk about Kate Chopin herself, or Kate O'Flaherty, as she started life. She started life in St. Louis, where she was born in 1850. In 1870, she came to New Orleans, and we'll focus on that too. But in 1850, she was born in New Orleans, born in St. Louis, and she was born to a couple who were an unusual couple by today's standards. And I'll show you a picture of them. Those are her parents. Now, when she was born, a couple of years after they had been married, but it was her father's second marriage. His first wife was named Catherine, and she died in childbirth. And he married a second wife and named their child Catherine, which seems a little spooky. But the more important thing that I wanted to stress, though, is that when he and his second wife, Kate's mother, were married, she was 16 and he was 39. So Kate Chopin, all her life, from the beginning, had questions to ask about marriage. You know, what would a 16-year-old and a 39-year-old have in common? Well, not much, as it turned out. But she was 5 years old when the first big impact event happened in her life. She was in boarding school at 5, which strikes it early. And it was All Saints' Day. And she got a message. Her father was one of the dignitaries in St. Louis, and he had been on the inaugural train going over a new bridge, the Gasconade Bridge. When the train went over the bridge collapsed. Her father and about 20 other men were drowned. So this was a 5-year-old kid in boarding school. She was brought home immediately, and encountering death at 5. But there are several important consequences of that. One of her best-known short stories later on, when she was a grown-up, was A Story of an Hour, about a woman who hears her husband has been killed in a train crash. It's an interesting story to compare with real life, because in real life, her father was dead, and she had to deal with death at an early age. And that was a big concept in her writing. But in the short stories she wrote about it, Story of an Hour, the woman is told that her husband is dead in a train crash. And at first she's sad, and then she's happy. Not that she resented him at all, but now she's free, body and soul free. And this is in a short story that Kate O'Flaherty wrote. Then the door opens, and the husband comes in. Turns out he's alive. And the wife sees him, has a heart attack, and dies. It's interesting that almost everybody laughs at a story like that, because it's not really funny. But a lot of Kate Chopin's work, as we'll see, has to do with things that are funny and sad at the same time. Like her son Felix, whom I mentioned earlier, a little bit after her death, he came to New Orleans and he said he wanted to see his mother's grave. But his mother's grave was in St. Louis, where he lived. So he lost his mom, too. Let us return to Kate O'Flaherty. She was the daughter of an Irish immigrant, a self-made man, a rich man, and a young woman who was of society, as much as you could have society in frontier St. Louis. And this young woman of 16, her family was destitute. So this is a long way of saying that she obviously married for money to support her kids, her siblings. She was the oldest of 8 children. But after Mr. O'Flaherty died, his widow, Eliza, Kate's mother, did not remarry. And this also comes into Kate's stories, because she writes a lot about widows. She was a widow herself, but they don't remarry. Now, one might ask, why did they not remarry? Well, one reason was that the way the law was written, a woman did not control her money if she was a wife. If she's a widow, she controls her own money. So we have Kate O'Flaherty as a 5-year-old seeing her mother controlling the money, really having power. And to show how this was important, in Kate's family, she was the 3rd or 4th generation of women who were widowed young and didn't remarry. After her, there were at least 3 more generations of women who were widowed young and did not remarry. It may make you think, why would anybody marry into that family? It's a sure death sentence. When I was researching Kate Chopin, I found out that her great-granddaughter had been arrested with the rock star Billy Idol. And I thought, well, if she marries him, if he marries her, he's going to die young. And I thought about letting him know. And then I saw him on MTV, and I decided not to let him know. But anyway, he's still alive, so not to worry. To return to Kate O'Flaherty, and I will start from the beginning. She was, or the 5-year-old beginning, when she was in boarding school, and then she came home because her father had died. She lived in a household, grew up in a household of widows, several generations of widows. She saw women doing everything. And that's a critical thing, because she knew at an early age that women could control money, could control power, could control land. Her family also owned slaves. And that's just a fact that we know. Kate was 10 years old when the Civil War came, and 15 when the Civil War ended. And she was aware of a lot of things in the war, because in St. Louis, where she lived, there were partisans on both sides. And she was at least once bothered, molested by a Yankee soldier. But her writing self began after the Civil War. And she graduated. Well, what I'm doing now is leading up to her writing career, but she had to go through several steps, and then we'll see what she did with those steps. So one of the steps was she had to finish high school. She went to the most prestigious high school in St. Louis, which was the Sacred Heart School. She learned what girl children, it was a girls' school, girl children hardly ever learned in the 19th century. That is, she learned about science. And that led her to write things that were unusual for a woman. Then after she graduated from high school, she married within a few years, married Oscar Chopin. So Kate O'Flaherty became Kate Chopin. They went on a European honeymoon. Now, this is something that interested me a lot because I discovered that she had written about her honeymoon in a diary. And I thought, all kinds of wicked things would happen. Well, women didn't put that kind of stuff in diaries. So you have to read between the lines. What she did, though, with Oscar, her new groom, is they went to England, went to France and Germany especially, and she saw the Franco-Prussian War begin. So here's one of several instances we might have been deprived of Kate Chopin. She and her new groom left Paris just when the blockade had started, the Franco-Prussian War, and thousands of French people starved to death. But she and Oscar got out just before the gates closed. So now they come back to the United States and they settle in New Orleans. She had grown up in St. Louis. They settled in New Orleans. You could see, until recently, you could see the house that she lived in on Magazine Street in New Orleans, but it doesn't exist anymore. What is most significant in New Orleans is they lived there for 9 years, and she had 6 children, 5 boys and a girl. Then, not surprising, I suppose, Oscar went bankrupt with 6 kids and a wife, and he had been kind of a stockbroker. So the family went to live with the land his family had owned in Cloutierville, which looks like Cloutierville in Natchitoches Parish. And this is the critical point in Kate Chopin's life, is the years she spent in Cloutierville. And after that, she became a writer. And now she's the 5th most taught writer in American literature. Who knew? She was unknown when I encountered her. I wrote the biography of her, which is why I did a lot of research and talked to a few people still alive who had known her. She was born in 1850, died in 1904. But the critical point was from 1879 to 1882, she lived in Cloutierville in Natchitoches Parish, which is a tiny town of about 700 people. The town itself is still only, only one street, one long dusty street. Kate Chopin had never lived in a town that small. And she was in some ways miserable, a city matron. On the other hand, she was fascinated by the people. They didn't speak English, for one thing. She could speak Creole French, and she spoke it better, but she was really a foreign land. And that's a great thing for a writer, to be in a foreign land where you can soak things up. And she soaked and she soaked. But it was cut short because Oscar died. her husband died. He died of swamp fever, which may have been yellow fever or malaria. Epidemics were common then. He died when she was 32 years old. She had 6 children. She was 32 years old. He had hardly made any money. And so she was faced with a big question of her life. What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to support myself? So there were several answers. One way is she sold some of her property, some of the land that she owned, because she was a widow. She owned the property. But there was another story too, and this is something that I discovered when I was doing research about her. She had written later on in her life about women who looked at men they were not married to with rather, let's say, romantic intentions. Well, after she was widowed, there was a man in town, in the town of Cloucheville, who had a hobby. His hobby was consoling widows. So he came by over the fence and consoled Kate Chopin. His name was Albert Zampate, and his great-grandson was the mayor of Natchitoches until recently. But anyway, Albert Zampate lived nearby. He consoled widows. He had a wife of his own. He owned a lot of land. He was one of the richest people in the parish, and one of the best looking and charming and so on. And I heard 100 years later that he was sweet on Kate, or she was sweet on him. Now, one might wonder why I'm talking about this. Well, one reason is that people who hear about it don't believe it, don't believe that there was some sort of affair or romance. And I've talked about it for conferences, excuse me, and one woman said to me, why are you spreading those old wives' tales? Why don't you have more evidence other than gossip? Well, and I asked her, if you were having an affair with somebody else's husband, would you write it in letters and diaries? Well, it turned out the woman I was talking to had written about it in letters or diaries, and that had broken up her first marriage. So this is by way of saying you learn a lot of gossip when you learn about Kate Chopin. And you learn that some of the things that were said about women are not true. And this takes us briefly to the 19th century, to the women's suffrage movement. Now, Kate Chopin dressed and looked like a woman of her era. I have a picture of her. This is when she was a belle, but this is what she became, a woman with lots of kids. So she was like most of the women of the 19th century. That is, she was rather constrained by the fact that she had children and responsibility for the children. Now, when Oscar died, she had an affair which was improper. And then she went back to St. Louis. Now, you might wonder, why did she go back to St. Louis? Well, one reason was that she was a scandal in Cloucheville, but another reason was she had children and 6 children, and she couldn't send, there wasn't any schooling for the children after the 8th grade, whereas St. Louis had the best public schools in the country. So she went back to St. Louis, and her son Felix, the little man who got confused about her later in life, he was a 140-pound quarterback, which he couldn't have done anywhere outside St. Louis. So now let's get to Kate Chopin's writing career. She's in St. Louis now. She's a widow. She's got 6 kids, and she's trying to think, what am I going to do with my life? and she turned to writing. This was the most common, probably the most common respectable career for a woman in the 19th century. And it was one of very few that a married woman could do, or a single woman could do, or anybody could do. And so she started writing short stories. And the first short stories she wrote she sent to magazines, and some of them were published, but they were set in St. Louis, and they didn't catch on because St. Louis was not that interesting to readers of the era. What readers were interested in was Louisiana. She had in her background, in her head, let's say in her head, in her memory, she had memories of Louisiana, of New Orleans, and of Clutcherville. And that's when she made her impact as a writer. So when I'm talking about Kate Chopin, she was highly regarded at her time, forgotten because she was kind of a scandal. And then she was rediscovered by people like me who loved scandal. So I'll tell you a little bit about her writing career and what happened with it. She sent her stories to be published or not be published. Mostly they at first they were not published. She didn't really have a handle on how to make a short story concise and important in just a few words. And she learned that by studying a French writer, Guy de Maupassant. So his writing it taught her how to write in a way that would appeal to readers. Eventually, his writing also was her downfall. So briefly, some of the things she did, she wrote short stories that were set in Louisiana that were big successes. One of them was about a woman who discovers that, well, let's say that she has a child. The story is called Desiree's Baby. She has a child, and the child is not totally white. This was a terrible thing. The racism was terrible in Kate Chopin's day. And having a child that was not white meant many things to the child, none of them good. And that's the story, Desiree's Baby. You should read the story because I can't do justice to it in a summary. But Kate Chopin published that story. And when she was forgotten for many years, that one story was remembered because it's shocking and it's sad and it's mysterious. That's the story, Desiree's Baby. There were other things that she wrote about. She wrote about Louisiana, about slavery, about racism, about women and men. And she wrote things that no one else wrote about women and men. She wrote about women who had eyes for other men. She wrote one story called A Respectable Woman, which ends with the woman saying, well, when her husband's friend comes back next year, I'll be very nice to him. And you want to see the sequel, but there is no sequel. And she became very popular among the women of St. Louis too, because she was willing to say unflattering things or things that women weren't supposed to say, such as almost anything that wasn't nice. But it was 1894 was her breakthrough. That was the year she was 44, when she began publishing in Vogue magazine, which was then and now a fashion magazine, but it was edited by a woman, eccentric woman. Kate Chopin loved eccentric women. An eccentric woman who wore a hat all the time, in bed, including in bed, and who didn't cotton to the morals of the day. I mean, she didn't do anything immoral as far as I know, but she allowed Kate Chopin to write stories about women who were a little bit immoral, a little bit independent. They were not classic passive wife and mom. So Kate Chopin became popular. She ran a salon in St. Louis. All the writers, anybody who's anybody would come to the salon. And then in 1899, she published The Awakening. The Awakening is a novel that is about a woman who's married, mother of two. And one summer at Grand Isle, parenthetical, Grand Isle is described in The Awakening as quite different from the way it is now. It's kind of industrial and, well, it's not so clean. In Kate Chopin's day, Grand Isle was a tropical paradise. It had acres of chamomile, and rich women, including Kate Chopin, rich women who were based in New Orleans would spend the summer on Grand Isle with their kids because it was away from New Orleans, which was what we say, a disease-ridden city, really. But in the summer at Grand Isle, women of Kate Chopin's class would often have flirtations with other men. And they usually didn't amount to anything. But in The Awakening, Kate Chopin's novel in 1899, the central character, Edna, has a more than flirtation with another man. And it leads her to reconsider her place in the universe and to finally decide what she wants to do with her life. And I'm not going to tell you what, because you've probably heard, but anyway, you should read The Awakening. Everyone should read The Awakening. Kate Chopin's masterpiece. And it turned out it was almost her last piece of work. Now, before The Awakening, she had published 2 collections of short stories, Bayou Folk and A Night in Acadie, and 1 novel called At Fault. So The Awakening was her 4th book. But in The Awakening, she had things that were not supposed to be in print in the United States. Guy de Maupassant in France had extramarital affairs. Well, I don't know whether he did actually, but his characters did, and it was no big deal because it was French. It was not proper for an American writer to do that kind of plot. So to condense the story a little bit, Kate Chopin published The Awakening and got some good reviews and some very scathing ones. They said one of the reviews said, a fact which we have all agreed should not be talked about, meaning adultery. Kate Chopin had pulled the curtain aside and told what women often did or thought about. And she was not favored. Actually, when I look back at the reviews, men mostly condemned it. Women actually liked it. But since she was considered an immoral person, because she had written such a novel, her writing career was basically destroyed. She wrote about 6 short stories afterwards, but she died 5 years after The Awakening appeared. And I think it was the condemnation, knowing that she could not tell the story she knew, what she really knew about women's lives, she could not tell it. She went into a depression, she went into a sickness, and she died of a stroke at age 54. And that would seem to be the end of her story. And it was the end of her story for about over 50 years. She was forgotten. But one of her short stories kept retained its vigor or interest. Desiree's Baby was the one story that survived. Then things happened. In 1960, in the 60s, there was a Norwegian grad student at Harvard who was writing about American literature. And his mother had been a suffrage leader, women's suffrage, women's right to vote in Norway. And he thought, well, he'd come to the United States and find out what people who were involved in suffrage, that is, in getting the right to vote, what they might have written. Now, you might ask, was Kate Chopin involved with suffrage? As far as we know, she was not involved in the movement for women's suffrage, but she did support women. Sometimes students ask, I've taught The Awakening many times, students ask, did Kate Chopin vote? No, she didn't, because women didn't have the right to vote. She died in 1904, and we didn't get the right to vote till 1920. So whether she longed to vote, I don't know. I think she's the kind of person who might have sneaked in if she could have. Anyway, in the 60s, Per Sejerstedt, who was Norwegian, was looking for writers about women's rights. And he came upon Kate Chopin, who's really been forgotten. And he couldn't believe she'd written that kind of book, The Awakening, in 1899. Around the same time, well, within 5 or 10 years of, I guess about 5 years of his discovery, I was a grad student. I was looking for someone to write about, a writer who had not been written about much, a woman writer who had written about forbidden things, Kate Chopin. And so I started writing about Kate Chopin and started thinking about her in the 1970s, and she's lived with me ever since. I've outlived her, but she's spoken to me at every age of my life. Well, maybe less so now because I'm older than she, but she went through a kind of midlife crisis when she was 29 or 30, and so did I. I went to grad school, which may have been a mistake. But there were always questions about women's lives that I found myself asking, and Kate Chopin had answered them. She talked about the outward life that conforms, the inward life that questions. She asked impertinent questions. When she was in New Orleans, she used to amuse Oscar, her husband, by doing imitations of birds, and priests. Well, the priests didn't know it, apparently. So I started writing about Kate Chopin. Since then, I've written 5 books, and there are still things I don't know. I don't know how she knew all the mature knowledge that's in The Awakening, how she could know all that in 1899, the things that the women's movement asked and questioned. When I first wrote about Kate Chopin, Women's History Month, which we are now having, March, Women's History Month had been forgotten. Now it's revived. When I started writing about women's lives and then about Kate Chopin's life, there was a quota. Every year, Harvard Medical School would take 3 women, only 3 women students. So women were not doctors. Women were not lawyers. Women had very controlled and very limited lives within my lifetime. It's not true anymore. Women are more than half the students in medical school, more than half the lawyers. And I don't think Kate Chopin did it herself in 1904, but I think she represents the climate where women can grow and achieve and learn. And so I urge you to read The Awakening. Read other things by Kate Chopin. Desiree's Baby is one. Think about what it was like to grow up with hoop skirts, as opposed to as we are now. Her son Felix, as I mentioned, said she hung around with people who wore peculiar clothing. Probably what they wore were bloomers, which were like Turkish pants, but they were intended as pants because women could move more easily in pants than in certainly a hoop skirt. That fad did not catch on in the 19th century because it was just too weird. But it was not long after I rediscovered The Awakening in the 1970s that women started wearing pants in the United States. Was it a coincidence? Who knows? So Kate Chopin liked for us to wear pants, I think. She herself, she had the 6 children I mentioned. Her children all went in odd directions. One of her sons became a doctor and studied diabetes in cats. And unfortunately, most of his patients died. But they don't now. She bequeathed to her future generations of women and men, and to her own children, a curiosity about the world that they still have, that we still have. And I think that what on Women's History Month, we should look at what we knew about women then, what we know now, how we've changed, how we've grown. And when we look at the women of the past, even women who were 174 this year, like Kate Chopin, they left us with questions and some answers, but told us to keep on questioning. So I will suggest that you continue to keep on questioning about women's lives, what's known, what isn't known. Speak up when you need to speak up. Vote, definitely vote. Kate Chopin couldn't vote, but you could vote twice. No, we shouldn't vote twice. But Louisiana, vote early and often. And she's part of the great history of Louisiana now. She's the 5th most taught women writer. And she's a gift from the past to us. So happy Women's History Month. Happy Kate Chopin.